This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
The BFM Breakfast Grill, connecting you to top people and ideas. Presented by U Mobile.
Good morning, I'm Melissa Idris, and today on The Breakfast Grill, I'm speaking to Dr. Ha-Joon Chang, author of several widely discussed books, including 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. He previously served as a consultant to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the European Investment Bank, and he currently lectures in Economics of Development at Cambridge University. Thank you so much for being on the show. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'd like to begin with your views on the Malaysian economy. The divergence of the path that Malaysia took and South Korea took is one that's fascinating. And you, being from South Korea and having studied the economy closely there, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Where did we start to diverge from South Korea?
Yeah, I think the critical difference was that we in Korea tried to develop our own local productive capabilities more aggressively than Malaysia has done. I mean, of course, Malaysia, compared to 50 years ago, compared to many other developing countries, has a very high level of capabilities, but it still hasn't reached the level that Korea has with leading international companies like Samsung and Hyundai and so on, because Malaysia has relied more on the foreign companies. It has failed to, well, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a strong expression, but extract technologies and managerial skills and so on from the foreign companies as much as South Korea has done. So I think the biggest difference was that Koreans said, even if it takes a bit longer, we want to eventually do it ourselves. So let's try to learn this, force the foreign companies to give us more technologies, and so on, whereas Malaysia was more relaxed about that aspect. So I think that was one critical difference. And of course, the second difference was the execution of industrial policies. So Malaysia also has fully recognized the need to diversify and upgrade and has implemented a lot of policies to get there. I think in terms of execution, it was less well-coordinated in Malaysia than in Korea, because Korea had a very well-coordinated system with the economic planning ministry, making sure that different ministries are not working at cross purposes.
So working together, talking to each other.
And also bringing the business community and government officials together on a regular basis for information exchange. And so it was better coordinated and better executed. So I think that was the other difference.
Yeah, because if you look at South Korea back in the 60s, right? So started out with natural resources as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
So similar to Malaysia with oil, South Korea had tungsten ore, had silk, had fish, had all these natural resources, and then moved along that chain.
That's
so
right.
labor-intensive manufacturing, they'd be slightly more sophisticated.
Yep.
Malaysia was also on that track as well, but sometime around the 90s was when we started to diverge, or would you say even earlier?
The divergence started earlier in the mid-70s, although it didn't show until, say, the late 80s, because that's when South Korea decided, okay, we've done quite well with assembling radios and TVs for American and Japanese companies, but we really need to build our own companies. So Samsung, which until the 60s was basically a company manufacturing textile and refining sugar, decided to get into electronics, invested in semiconductors. Hyundai, which used to be a construction company, went into shipbuilding automobile in the 70s. Yeah, of course, in the beginning, no one noticed because these were terrible companies. I still remember back in 1977, when I was a 13-year-old boy, there was this big headline in Korean newspapers: South Korea exports its first cars. Turns out we sold 6 cars to Ecuador. And my guess is probably Hyundai, the company that sold those cars, paid the Ecuadorians to buy the cars. Who wants to buy a Korean car in 1977? So that in the beginning it wasn't clear, but by the late 80s, it really built these industries, became the biggest shipbuilding nation in the world, became the third largest producer of semiconductors. So that is when that critical divergence happened, because that was the period when South Koreans said we need to go to the next level, even if we achieved quite a lot at this level. And in order to do that, we need to create our own companies, invest more in R&D. Unfortunately, Malaysia didn't do that phase as well. And that's the cause of divergence.
A lot of what you're saying seems to be focused on manufacturing as opposed to services. Yeah. What do you make of Malaysia's push to focus on growing our services sector as opposed to manufacturing? Do you think that by increasing the share of services, it will produce that expected high-paying jobs that we observe in most industrialized countries?
Yes. First of all, the difficulty with talking about the service sector is that it includes everyone from bankers working for Goldman Sachs to ladies selling noodles on the street,
That's a service too.
That's right. It's a very diverse sector. So there are some segment of the service industry which is very high-paying, high productivity, can be easily exported, like banking service, consulting services. There are other segments of service sector which are very low productivity, like selling noodles on the street and cannot be exported. So we are talking about a very heterogeneous category of activities. But I think even though some service sector has shown very rapid productivity growth and increasing export orientation, still in terms of productivity and exportability is well behind the manufacturing sector. Because, physically, services are not necessarily impossible to export. But the trouble is that rich countries don't want immigration. So no one has found a way to provide cleaning service long distance. That's right. So that's the fundamental difficulty with service export. Although, with the development of internet, you have made it possible to export some services like, Indian technicians reading MRI scans in Bombay and sending them back to Boston for the next morning, and workers in the Philippines manning the call center and so on. Yeah? But in general, expansion in the service trade hasn't been actually that great. The share of service trade in world trade actually has been more or less the same in the last 20 years, around 20%.
Been stagnant.
That's right. So there has been some sectors where it has increased, but its effect hasn't been overwhelming. Yeah? Also, from my point of view, the most important thing is that the manufacturing sector is still where innovation happens. Because if you look at the United States, look at Britain, these countries have lost huge amount of manufacturing sector in the last 3-4 decades. So manufacturing sector in those countries only account for about 10% of GDP. But still 70% of R&D is done in the manufacturing sector. I'm not saying that services are bad or, it has no future and so on, but you really need to look at this carefully, in the same way that not all manufacturing sectors are equally promising, not all service sectors are good. So don't get swayed by this big picture rhetoric about, the post-industrial age. There are some promising service sectors that you should develop, but thinking that all service sectors are somehow now superior to manufacturing is very misleading.
Well, I guess it stems from the idea that you deindustrialize and then you move from manufacturing to a high-end service sector. And that was the idea for Malaysia. But the question is whether you see Malaysia suffering from negative deindustrialization or premature deindustrialization.
Yeah, and actually, there are two types of deindustrialization. One is the positive one, in which manufacturing sector shrinks because it becomes so productive. In order to produce the same output, you need to do less of it. Yeah? So this is the kind of industrialization that happened with countries like Germany, Switzerland, Sweden. Yeah? So yes, you need to understand the cause of this carefully. But to give you an analogy, saying that manufacturing is not important because it's now small is a bit like saying that car engine is not important because it counts for only 10% of the car's weight. Yeah? The engine might have become actually smaller because it's more efficient. Yeah? That doesn't mean that you can run a car without an engine. Yeah? So you have to really carefully look at the details, what has grown, what has declined. Has this decline been due to productivity growth or loss of competitiveness? Only then you can say, yes, Malaysia should try to revive manufacturing, or it should move to services. I mean, without that kind of analysis, you cannot say what course of action is the correct one.
I'm speaking to Dr. Ha-Joon Chang, Director of the Centre of Development Studies at the University of Cambridge. We're going to continue our conversation in just a few minutes, so stay tuned to The Breakfast Grill, BFM 89.9.
You are listening to the BFM Breakfast Grill, brought to you by U-Mobile.
Thanks for staying with us. I'm Melissa Idris and I'm speaking to Dr. Ha-Joon Chang, one of the world's leading economists in development economics. I'd like to touch on the issue of industrial policy. So let's take a look at some of the lessons that Malaysia can learn from Northeast Asian industrial policy, countries like Japan, like Taiwan, like South Korea, even from China. Yeah. What lessons do you think, specific lessons that Malaysia can learn from these countries?
Well, I think the first lesson to be learned is deciding what activities to promote. You need a more open discussion involving, not just government officials and politicians, but also business leaders, as well as, more impartial observers like academics and journalists and so on. The Japanese did it the best. Koreans did it less well. But, there was a continuous discussion. Government collects a committee. They go through many, many details, writes a white paper, and they get criticized and debated. I mean, it was actually quite interesting because, Korea and Taiwan at the time were military dictatorships, and they shut people up for criticism, but not for this. So for industrial policy, actually, there was a lot of freedom of speech. The sectors to promote were selected in a kind of more informed, interactive way. The second difference was that, the policies were better coordinated, as I mentioned earlier in the program. There were these coordinating agencies, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, which are in charge of industrial policy, which should make sure that education policy and training policy is in line with industrial policy, your infrastructure policy is in line with industrial policy, so that your energy is not dissipated.
So education, to make sure education was in line with industrial policy.
Yes, I mean, for example, when South Korea wanted to develop the electronics industry, the government in the early 70s started pouring in huge amount of money in developing departments of electronics engineering. Because until then, I mean, the country didn't have departments of electronics engineering. Seeing that this is going to be one of the leading industries 10 years later.
You want to make sure that you have a pipeline of talent.
Yeah. And I would say, thirdly, the difference was that these countries, they were not perfect, but they were better at kind of admitting failure. So
what do you mean by that?
Whatever you do, you will have some success, some failures. Because no one succeeds all the time. Private sector companies fail all the time. Even the best companies make mistakes. And yes, I mean, industrial policymakers in Japan, Korea, and so on made lots of mistakes, but they were rather good at admitting that this was a mistake and fold the policy or revise the policy. And I think they were better at that than some other countries, which didn't want to admit failure and then kept supporting industries that have no future. I mean, it's a difficult exercise because, even if it looks like a failure today, it may actually succeed 10 years later. When Toyota tried to export its first cars to the United States back in 1958, it was a total failure. And a lot of Japanese people argued that we should close down the car industry. So it, at that time, looked like a total failure. 20 years later, the Japanese were conquering the world car market.
Well, Malaysia is considering producing a third national car. There's been a lot of backlash from that because of some of the baggage from our first national car, Proton. It's kind of going back to our manufacturing roots. And manufacturing seems to be passé, given the push into services. What do you think about having a third national car?
Well, it depends on how you want to do it. I mean, if you want to have a second run of Proton, probably it's not going to be very successful. But, that national car could mean electric car. It could mean cars based on the hydrogen fuel cells.
Energy efficient cars.
That's right. So simply because it's a car which has a bad reputation here because of the Proton history, I wouldn't object to it simply because of that. But, as they say, the devil's in the details, What kind of car are you going to make, Are you going to need some kind of alliance with a foreign company because you are a new guy, you might need technology transfer, you might need access to market. If you're going to collaborate with a foreign company, is it going to be Ford or Hyundai or Toyota, And yes, as a small country, you have to export. But then that itself is not an obstacle. Finland is only 5 million people, Sweden 10 million. These guys have industrialized quite successfully despite that constraint. But you have to be aware of the constraint that size is going to impose on you because, for example, in car industry, I'm not talking about electric cars at this moment, but in conventional cars, you have to produce at least 300,000 units and ideally 500,000 in order to achieve what economists call scale economy. Because when you have huge amount of machines and equipment being used, how many cars you produce has a huge impact on the unit cost of the car. So today, they say it's 300,000 minimum, 500,000 ideally. It could rise further. And for a country like Malaysia, this will be a big scale. So you need to export from early on. And then that poses another set of problems because export markets have higher quality standard.
Sure.
And so
there are many things to consider.
That's right, exactly. Like in any business plan, you need to consider all these things. The conclusion might be if we produce this particular type of car in alliance with such and such company, which shouldn't necessarily last. Korea went first, like Proton, when Hyundai went into car production, it had a major partnership with Mitsubishi, but it ended after 10 years, because they developed their own engine. So if the conclusion is that, why not the national car? We need to see that plan.
Right.
It can't be just that because cars are somehow important, sexy, you should go into cars.
I guess I'm asking because, it brings us back to the manufacturing roots of Malaysia. Back in the 70s when Malaysia saw some accelerated economic growth because of our push to the process of industrialization, I'm wondering whether it's too late for Malaysia now. What do we need to do to get back on track?
Well, this country has deindustrialized a little bit, but, it's not like, say, in the UK where manufacturing base has been so eroded. It's basically not recoverable. Mm-hmm. In the UK, the problem is very serious. Since the financial crisis in 2008, the pound sterling has devalued like 60%, about 40%. In other contexts, that would create a huge export boom because now your exports are 40% cheaper. Unfortunately, in the UK, the manufacturing trade deficit is refusing to budge because there are no producers to take advantage of that kind of currency devaluation.
Right.
So their base has been really weakened. This country hasn't reached that level, so I think it should be possible to revive the manufacturing sector. But, it doesn't just get revived because you wish it to be. You need to make the right investment in
Sure.
machines, R&D, labor force, education, infrastructure. You have to work at it. You need a good plan.
But what we're seeing, in fact, is a move away from E&E exports to more commodity-based exports. The manufacturing has shifted. Electrical and electronic exports went from a peak share of 60% of total exports in the early 2000s to about 40% last year. Commodities was up from 13% to 20% in the same period.
Yeah, that's a worrying sign. If it's a processed commodity, it's not necessarily a bad thing because, a lot of things you can add a lot of value through processing. Mm-hmm. If it's a processed commodity, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But if it's an unprocessed commodity rising, it is a bad sign.
Because we want to diversify and move up the value chain.
Exactly, yeah. No, basically the most important principle is that you want to be doing something that few others can do. Yeah? No, essentially, there are 3-4 countries that can, for example, build a nuclear power reactor. US, Canada, China, Korea, France, 5 countries. there are essentially like 6 countries that can build its own car engine. Japan, Korea, the U.S., Germany, France. So you want to be in that group.
Right.
In the end, it doesn't matter exactly what it is. Because the fewer there are people who can do it, the more value you can get from those activities. So even if it's something related to your natural resource, palm oil or something like that, if you add enough value and turn it into, I don't know, the vegetable oil and then some kind of oleochemical and then, biodiesel or whatever, there might be some part of that value chain which only you occupy or only a few other countries occupy, and then I have nothing against that simply because it started from a tree. So that should be the principle. In the end, it doesn't matter as far as it involves the dynamic technology, high added value, and the high knowledge content.
Well, if I could end on, say, a slightly personal note, I'd like to find out why you decided to become an economist. What do you like and what do you dislike about it?
No, at the very beginning, it was a kind of very naive desire to understand what was going on because, I grew up during the days of Korean economic miracle, and there were so many positive and negative things going on. Living standards were rising and the cities were springing up almost overnight, but then there were worker strikes and, the demolition of slums by the development company aided by the police and huge amount of social conflict. And I just wanted to understand what was going on. And yes, as I studied it more and more, I found it more and more interesting.
Is there anything you dislike about it?
Well, not about the subject per se, but what I dislike is that the currently dominant type of economics, which is the overly technical and not so interested in the real world, because the currently dominant school of economics, neoclassical school. Not everyone who practices that school is like that. Like say Joe Stiglitz, he's not like that, but many people who follow that tradition wants to build up beautiful, elegant mathematical models. And, in order to do that, you have to simplify the world.
Yes.
You have to make a lot of assumptions about what people are like, what the environment is like, what rules are like, And then, you have a beautiful model, but then you can apply it to the real world. Yeah?
Thank you so much for being on the Breakfast Grill today.
Thank you.
I've been speaking to Dr. Ha-Joon Chang, renowned development economist and author of 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. I'm Melissa Idris for BFM 89.9, the business station.
The Breakfast Grill is brought to you by U-Mobile, Frost & Sullivan Malaysia's mobile data service provider of the year.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.